Yes, well, my dad volunteered for service in World War II. He was in the 2nd 30th Battalion, sent up to Malaysia, etc. He ended up prisoner of war of the Japanese for 3.5 years. It's sort of interesting talking to him about that because he never had much to say, but they only ever spoke about fun things. He never showed any animosity towards the Japanese, but would often laugh at their antics, etc. They talk about things like he was once given a bag by a Japanese soldier and he's told to take it up to a guard post because it's their lunch in there. On the way he opened the bag and there's half a dog in there. So those sorts of things they talk about, but and he never could understand the Japanese because of how they treated them. But as I say, having said that, I've never heard him speak badly of them. He just didn't, couldn't understand them, how they could be so cruel and that sort of thing. I was really interested and excited, to be honest. I didn't have any queries about. It never entered my mind not to, or to, try and find some excuse not to go or whatever. I was happy enough to be part of it. Yeah. You start off at Kapuka where you just have 3 months of basic stuff. Teach you how to march and lessons in basic military stuff. Singleton's, you just do infantry corps training. They teach you, what infantry soldiers do out in the bush, etc. And do a lot of shooting and so forth. Yeah. Well, Canungra was a jungle training centre. And that consisted of a series of short exercises, etc., and also the different ranges. You had ranges where you'd walk along with a submachine gun and something would pop out, target, and you'd engage it, that sort of thing. But also, how to live in the bush, how to be quiet and so forth, and you get together with your understanding your field craft and just general basic, infantry tactics, etc. Yeah. Rifle shooting, etc., and throwing grenades, etc., started at basic training. Then when you went to infantry training, they just did more of it, and you then had other weapons like the M60, you got lessons on that. And depending on what position you had in infantry sections, what weapons you carried. And then that was decided once you went to your battalion, allocated to a platoon in a section. It was nearly 12 months of training before he went to Vietnam. Now, a lot of other people, who were replacements, etc., they didn't have that. We had, they'd have infantry corps training and jungle training centre, and then you'd be off somewhere, whereas we had some major exercises with the battalion as well. So from that point of view, we're pretty lucky. We're very confident, probably because we didn't know better. I hadn't been to an Asian country previously, and so you're just surprised at what's going on, so to speak. We were given briefings on it, and what responsibilities we had there, because you had a section of perimeter that was you were to guard when you're in back there, and had the trenches where they're sighted and all that sort of stuff, and you just got a rundown on how it operated. And it's pretty, straightforward sort of stuff. Yeah. All the bunkers and so forth had always been built by the previous battalion there. We just took over what was already there. There's a lot of lectures and basically acclimatisation, and the things that you needed, day-to-day things that were important, that they, taking your anti-malarial drugs and that sort of thing. And they sort of emphasised the basics, you fill up your water out in the bush, what you'd do to make sure that you're not going to get sick from it or whatever. Just those very basic things. When we arrived over there full of confidence, etc., but you didn't really know what you're letting yourself in for. So you learnt by things how you do things differently, etc. I think the other thing, that when you spend so much time in the jungle, you get to understand it. Like when we first went over there, you could hear these. We didn't know what it was, but there's monkeys. They'd sort of, the way they'd move through the treetops, the sort of crunching leaves, etc. The first time we heard them, it sounded like people walking, so you just get the same as it smells like people would laugh, say, oh, you could smell a Vietnamese camp by their cooking and so forth, and we'd know they were there. Well, you smelt yourself after you've been out in the bush for 3 or 4 weeks and haven't had a shower. You can imagine they could smell us pretty well as well. So what I'm sort of getting at, it's time spent there in the jungle, you become more aware of everything around you. So if somebody come in there as a replacement, first up, it's a learning process for them, and just other things, you really need to be quiet about what you're doing, whether it's a simple thing of packing up in the morning and so forth, and so the basic things you keep an eye on, Blakes, but overall it's just that everyone was in the same, had the same understanding. We set out in the morning. You're looking for any enemy signs, etc. Sometime into the initial thing, we found a trail where the enemy had been just some broken branches every 10, 20 metres or whatever, so that and we followed that up. Then come to the edge of a bunker system. Our gunner opened fire almost simultaneously with an enemy soldier who was one of the forward bunkers. We went to ground then and moved forward. There's about 17 of us, as I remember it. And of course, as I say, these bunkers are strategically placed. They've got an interlocking fire. And the principal weapon of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese was an AK-47. It fires a 7.62 short round. And it's an ideal weapon over those short distances. So it's just like having, just as effective as a machine gun because it's so close, or that you're so close to them. So we went to ground, moved forward on the sort of right flank, as I remember it. There was some grenades thrown into bunkers, and then they were thrown out. Blakes got hit by the shrapnel, etc., and then it sort of went from there. The platoon commander was badly wounded, and the medic ran forward to help someone who else had been shot or blown up. I don't remember now, but he got shot. And to cut a long story short, out of 17 people, you had 3 killed and 6 wounded. But the problem being that you were there, you weren't going anywhere. You couldn't you couldn't go forward, and you're obviously not going to go back with, you couldn't move that amount of people who were waiting to be relieved. That seemed to go on for a long, long while, and then I think it was a B company arrived on the scene, and then they were choppering the wounded out into the night. And as I say, well, 2 people were dead on the ground there, and one died on the helicopter going back to Vung Tau. Yeah. It's all this, yeah, all from 7th Platoon. It was, you know, obviously decimated by that, because out of those, all those killed and wounded, and obviously none of them were back in the platoon. The actual patrol that went on that thing, there was 17 of us. So, yeah, that, it's just one of those things. You were stuck there, you couldn't go forward, you couldn't go back. It was, you know, before, because it's so close, you could have the leaves and twigs sort of coming down on you, but you'd shoot and they shoot, but they couldn't quite get their weapon down. And if you stood up, you were in big trouble. The gunner was in where was just the sort of one side, and he went forward to a tree, and instantly he was killed. And once this happened, you were sort of stuck there. You couldn't pull back, because there was too many people that were, you know, badly wounded. Unfortunately, I landed in Hong Kong, and I contracted malaria, or had malaria, and I got put in the British military hospital there. So I was gone for 19 days, and nobody knew where I was, because I was supposed to be back after 5 days. But I always remember being sort of delirious, if you like, in the hotel I was in, and I called for room service, and I wanted, for some strange reason, a glass of lemon juice. I just wanted squeezed lemon juice for whatever reason, and he wanted $50 for it or something, you know. And I remember that, but I was sort of not in a real good place. So anyway, this wave of the feeling delirious and sweating and all this has come and go. As soon as I felt that I was able to, I went straight to the hospital. I was just standing there and told them I wasn't well. This nurse put took the temperature, and then there was a bit of a panic session to get a wheelchair and so forth to cart me off, and so I was there for all up in hospital just over two weeks, and away for 19 days. Yeah. I suppose the most important thing is I bought this Rolex watch there in 1968. I've had it for 50 years. It was 116 American dollars, Australian dollars rather, which is equivalent to 122 American dollars. It's a bit different now, of course, but yeah. That was about the only thing I could do there, because they let me out of hospital for a couple of days and I still wasn't real well. I think the thing to understand as far as the bunker systems that go, I mean, they weren't just bunkers put anywhere, they were always sited to, you know, in a way that they have interlocking fire, and there'd be sort of vegetation amongst them about, say, a metre high. But if you laid down or got inside the bunker and looked out, the stem of that vegetation halfway up would be clear. And of course, if you're walking through that, you can't tell that. But if you're down on the ground in a bunker, you can see exactly what's going on before they can sight you. You know, so basically, they were very well planned. I mean, they've been doing it for a long, long time. They were fighting the French before the Second World War, or the Japanese, wasn't it, or whatever. So when it comes to sighting them, and we once went into one which is in a Y shape. If you look at a Y, if you put a gun on the tip of the three points of a Y, and there's a central bunker where you could shoot out of anywhere within that Y. No matter what way you approach that, you'd have three guns firing at you, you know. So, and again, when you look at the way they position them things, you know, very dangerous. And later, in fact, one time we were moving into that particular bunker system, and luckily Bill Dolan saw some movement up there. Now, it wouldn't matter if there's 3 or 4 people in that, or 300 or 400 people, no matter what way you approach it, it was, you know, you can't not take casualties. So we were able to pull back and drop our artillery on it, rather than just if you tried to assault it. Every time you went into those things, that you'd come off second best. But just the point I make is that they'd been doing that for a long while. They're very well constructed, and you know, from a defensive position in that sort of area, to be able to take no matter what way you come in there, you can take fire from 3 positions. It's very well, you know, constructed, very well planned, and very well positioned. And, yeah, so you can't take that away from them. You'd be given an area to cover, and basically it was, you know, it could be referred to as search and destroy or whatever. But you're just looking out for seeking the enemy wherever it might be. You know, you had an area of operations, and the CO, etc., would work out a plan of what they wanted, and you just went along with it. You know? Yeah. The longest time I was out in the bush without a break was 6 weeks, and I changed my greens once in that time. But a lot of the operations about a month. You'd just be out there, come back, have a week or so, have a few beers, and then off you go again. Yeah. I can remember it as clear as a bell. We sat on that plane, and I thought, well, we're home. And the Qantas staff were amazing. It was just, you know, a tremendous feeling, because the truth is, you know, you've been hyper vigilant for, you know, months on end, you know, stomping around the bush, etc., and you know, just sitting there on that plane before it took off, you know, I felt I was home, you know, and yeah, so it was pretty strange, but you know, a good feeling. Yeah. I had a large group of good mates we played football with as teenagers, and you know, we first went to the pubs together and all this sort of thing. We were a very tight group, and I missed them, you know, terribly. And I thought, you know, was really looking forward to meeting up with them. Well, they were on another planet. As you know, the things that everything sort of changed for me, your priorities, your understanding, etc. And I just couldn't relate to them, you know. And that's why you know, I found that the best thing I could do was to go back in the army. And I think, as it turned out, the best thing I did. As I say, I couldn't relate, but wasn't settled, you know, and I just seemed to be confused more than anything. It sounds a bit mean, but you know, the blokes that I'd knocked around with and that, they were still cracking the same jokes we had when we were 15 or something, and what was important to them or what might upset them. I mean, if you've sort of been in situations, you know, where your blokes have been ripped to bits and you've, you know, retrieved their bodies and so forth, everything sort of priorities change. Things that, you know, they'd be upset about something that I just see as so insignificant, but just, I don't say everybody was like that, but most people are the same. It was very hard to relate. I mean, you matured in Vietnam from the first sort of contact you had, you know, because the thing is that you make a mistake and you're in trouble, you know. And I think also, you know, having been, you know, seeing your mates killed, etc., you're just on a different plane to other people. You know, relate to other soldiers, etc., and that sort of remained to this day, you know. It's very hard to for other people to understand that, you know. It's not anyone's fault, it's just a fact of life, you know. So I went back in the army. I went to SAS, and I couldn't believe it. You know, places full of nutters, mad as hatters, a lot of them, which was fantastic for me. I fitted in perfectly. I loved it. And I had 16 wonderful years there. It was a privilege of, you know, and to serve there. I was very, very lucky. I went from a trooper to a warrant officer and liked every minute I was there. Yeah. And the best thing I ever did was to come back in the army because, as I said, I couldn't relate to anything much. And I think the discipline, etc., was good for me, and it paid dividends, yeah. The Vietnam War was still on when I joined SAS. My intention was to do a tour with them, and it didn't eventuate. But they then had to sort of regroup, if you like, and look at how the regiment was going to operate. They had formed a vehicle-mounted troop, a water operations group, and a free-fall parachuting group. Well, I was in the water operations group. I was very lucky there. I got involved in the initial training they did, and from a point of view of interest and so forth, you know, it was terrific. And then the counter-terrorist thing started. The Fraser government wanted the counter-terrorist training to take place, and I was heavily involved in that from then until I left. I was a patrol commander, then a troop sergeant, then I was a senior instructor of the demolitions wing. Then I was a squadron sergeant major of the counter-terrorist squadron for about 2.5 years. That ended my time there. Yeah. It's sort of interesting that the furthest on Australia you can get posted from Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne in Perth was the tip of Cape York, and so I think by moving me there, they'd had enough of me. That's as far away from the places they could go. But no, I had a fantastic time there. It was a privilege, and I'm very fortunate to have had that 16 years in SAS. Yeah. I used to go to the RSL with my mother and father. The thing was with, in particular, with World War II blokes, they stuck together. You know, their drug of choice was alcohol. You know, so they'd all of them were in the RSL, and anyway, the first thing I did would be, because my dad had been in the RSL, Coogee Randwick RSL, and that's where we went many times. So I was pretty quick to go there to become a member. Anyway, I fronted in there and I spoke to somebody, and he said to me, I just got to check to see if we have to take you. And I sort of just confused. I don't know what he meant by that, to be honest. I thought, am I hearing right? Or anyway, he come back then with the paperwork and done it. Nothing further was said. But I found out some time later, another friend of mine, he went to join a year earlier. He was, and they wouldn't have him. I was the first regular army soldier sent up there, posted to there. When we landed there, I had been up to look at what the situation was, and we drove from Perth with wife and 4 kids in a non-air conditioned Land Cruiser up to Cairns, and then we flew up to Cairns to Weipa. My wife was astonished. She didn't talk to me for 4 days, but anyway, we had time up there. The kids loved it. And my job was working with the Aboriginal groups. There's places like Cowanyama, Edward River, Arakoon, and all of the Sioux Island, Thursday Island, Murray Islands, Bamaga, Weipa South, that's where the Army Reserve were coming from, and I was involved in courses for them and recruiting them and that type of thing. Yeah. Well, I think some of the World War I blokes told the World War II blokes they had it easy compared with them. I mean, it's something, but at the end of the day, if you're under, you're hyper vigilant for extended periods and being shot at and so forth. I don't care whether it's Timor or it's New Guinea or it's the Middle East or whatever. It doesn't matter. I mean, that's the end result is the same, And people with PTSD, I mean, if you read stuff in Roman times, there's plenty of that kicking around then. It's always been there. If you subject people to that, and I use the terminology of being hypervigilant, that come from a GP I used to see who was better than any psychiatrist, and in that job I did involved with veterans matters. I mean, I met professors of psychiatry and all that sort of stuff, but being hyper vigilant for extended periods of time, you pay a price for that. And even today, like I had a Minister for Veterans Affairs say to me, "Oh, Blue, we've got some concerns about the multiple deployments of soldiers, from Iraq and into Afghanistan. There's some concerns that they'd have an accumulative effect on their mental health, because I don't know, SAS blokes have done 5, 10, tours, etc." And I said, "Well, Minister, why would you think otherwise? I mean, it's a common sense thing. That's how, of course, that's how it is. If you you subject people to all this extended period." So it was once put to me, the reason they cut the tours to 6 months was because they reckoned that Vietnam proved a year at a time. And it's always intense when you're non-stop doing your job. It's the same as what these blokes in Afghanistan do. But that will have an effect on anybody. Well, some people apparently aren't affected, but they're psychopaths. So otherwise, that's the truth of the matter. So you pay a price for that. But the point I make about that particular minister was that was in 2007, here we are 16 years later and we're still talking about the same issues, you know, but I don't think there's any way around it myself. If you're going to send people to war, things will happen and people will be affected for it. It's just, as I say, the psychopaths apparently aren't affected so much with PTSD or soldier's heart, they called it in First World War, and then there's shell shock and all this sort of stuff, but call it whatever you like. There's a, you know, and you bring those problems back to your family, etc., and they're always there, you know. Yeah.